His Excellency, Vice Rector, dear guests, dear colleagues, dear students. I would like to welcome you all to today's lectures and to our campus. We have been delighted to be hosting valuable architects and scholars here in Izmir in the context of the Building for Humanity International Design Competition. Today, we have the fortune of listening to two lectures, one by Professor JUHANI PALLASMAA and another one by architect Shen Yuan Huang. Before introducing our distinguished guests, I would like to take this opportunity to thank to a number of people who has worked very hard to make this event happen. First, I would like to thank to our faculty members, especially to Feray Maden, and also to Belgin Terim Çavka, İpek Ek, Sergio Tadonio, and Ecehan Özmehmet. I would also like to thank to our research assistants, Müge Sever, Selin Güngör, Ecenur Kızılörenli, Ömer Can Balkan, Deniz Engin, İrem Akçam, Feyza Durmuşlar, Selin Aktan, and Duhan Ölmez. Next, I would like to thank very much to my colleague, Chen-Yu Chiu, for introducing the idea of bringing this event to Izmir and to Yaşar University. Thank you, Cho. I would also like to thank his assistants, Yıldız Kılınçer and Selin Şahin, who has been working very hard with us this week. Third, I would like to thank Izmir Architecture Center for collaborating with Yaşar University in organizing these series of events. Finally, my special thanks go to all of our guests and jury members for coming to Izmir and for making this event happen. Now, it's my great honor to introduce our first speaker, Professor JUHANI PALLASMAA, a distinguished Finnish scholar and architect who has influenced many architects, designers, and scholars all over the world. He has a lifetime full of accomplishments, which I will humbly try to summarize by reading a short biography. JUHANI PALLASMAA has practiced architecture since the early 1960s and established his own office, JUHANI PALLASMAA Architects, in 1983. He has held positions as director of the Institute of Industrial Arts in Helsinki from 1970 until 1971, director of the Museum of Finnish Architecture from 1978 until 83, state artist professor from 1983 until 1988, and professor and the dean at the Helsinki University of Technology from 1991 up until 1997. PALLASMAA has taught and lectured widely in Europe, in North and South America, Australia, Africa, and Asia. He also published books and numerous essays on the philosophy and critique of architecture and the arts in over 30 languages. He became universally known through his lectures and books on architectural theory and his interest in phenomenology. In his widely read 1996 book, The Eyes of the Skin, Architecture and the Senses, he stressed the importance of experience in architectural production. PALLASMAA has received 5 honorary doctorate degrees and numerous Finnish and international prizes. He was an academician and the international academician of the International Academy of Architecture in 2012, and a member of the very prestigious Pritzker Architecture Prize jury from 2008 until 2014. Some of the awards that he has been granted are the Schelling Prize for Architectural Theory in 2014, Plym Professorship from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the United States in 2013, Dean's Medal from Washington University in St. Louis in 2012. Alfred Kordelin, a prize for lifetime achievement in Helsinki in 2010. Arnold W. Brunner Prize for Architecture from American Academy of Arts and Letters in New York in 2009. Silver plaquette from the Museum of Finnish Architecture in 2006. Finland Prize in 2000. The International Union of Architects Award for Architectural Criticism in 1999, Fritz Schumacher Prize in 1997, Russian Federation Architecture Award in 1996, Helsinki City Culture Award in 1993, Finnish National Architecture Award in 1992, and the list goes on, but I think I will stop here. And I'm honored to have Professor JUHANI PALLASMAA with us. I would like to welcome him to the stage.
All right? Yeah. Fine. Sorry? Yes. Dear friends, good afternoon, and thank you for the very generous introduction. Thank you, and excuse me for having bothered you with such a long curriculum, but I've been around for quite a while. Before I start my lecture proper, I would just like to say or emphasize that I have spent most of my life as an architect. At the largest, my office was 54 assistants. I had one of the largest architecture offices in Finland. But I closed my office entirely in 2011. And ever since that year, I have been only writing 10 hours every day, Saturdays and Sundays included. Today, I'm going to speak on a somewhat philosophical subject about architecture as existential meaning in architecture. But on Saturday in the workshop, I will speak about my work, both design work and literary work. Although I closed my office, I don't feel personally that I have stopped being an architect. I'm still an architect, but this time in words, writing. So I'm writing in the same way as I have designed architecture before that. Modern architectural theory, education and practice have regarded architecture as visually composed and aestheticized spaces, material structures and forms, and have primarily studied the historical, technical and formal characteristics. These analyses have focused on architecture as physical objects and spaces and their geometric, compositional, and symbolizing qualities, as well as the representation of these properties in drawings and conceptual schemes. As architecture does not possess a comprehensive theory of its own, the approach and methods of research have usually been borrowed from other disciplines in accordance with changing interests and fashions. Often the applicability of the chosen theoretical and intellectualized frameworks have been rather questionable in the specific embodied reality of architecture, as for instance in the case of the linguistic and deconstructionist theories which were popular in the 1980s. Although I am frequently introduced as a theoretician, I dare to question the feasibility of a comprehensive theory of architecture due to the inherent internal complexities, contradictions, and irreconcilabilities of the architectural phenomenon. Through their relative artistic autonomy and focus, the fine arts are fundamentally less complex and contradictory in their ontological grounding than architecture. The inherent internal complexity of architectural projects was pointed out by my great countryman Alvar Aalto in his inaugural lecture as member of the Academy of Finland in 1955. This is what he said: "Whatever our task, whether large or small, in every case, opposites must be reconciled. Almost every formal assignment involves dozens, often hundreds, sometimes thousands of conflicting elements that can be forced into functional harmony only by an act of will. This harmony cannot be achieved by any other means than art. The final value of individual technical and mechanical elements can only be assessed afterwards. A harmonious result cannot be achieved with mathematics, statistics, or probability calculus." So this was Alvar Aalto in 1955. Aalto's declaration 60 years ago of the supremacy of art over science was a courageous statement, considering the fact that some of the most authoritative thinkers in Finland were in the audience, the leading philosophers, mathematicians, etc. Aalto's view of the integrating power of art has recently been supported by Vittorio Gallese, one of the discoverers of the mirror neurons in the University of Parma 30 years ago. With much, this is what Gallese, who has become a friend of mine, writes, quote, "From a certain point of view, art is more powerful than science. With much less expensive tools and with greater power of synthesis, artistic intuitions show us who we are, probably in a much more exhaustive way with respect to the objectifying approach of the natural sciences. Being human squares with the ability to ask ourselves who we are. Since the beginning of mankind, artistic creativity has expressed such ability in its purest and highest form." This is a rather surprising statement by a scientist, and you would hardly expect a scientist, leading one, to give so much credit to the artistic approach. The inherently unscientific nature of architecture arises from the fact that its practice fuses facts and dreams, knowledge and beliefs, rationality and emotion, as well as temporal dimensions of past, present, and future. Besides, it is simultaneously the means and the end, a means to achieve its utilitarian and practical purposes, and an end as an artistic and existential manifestation that mediates experiential, cultural, mental, and emotional values and qualities. In short, architecture is conceptually too impure or messy as a phenomenon of human activity to be logically structured within a single theory. A theory of architecture sounds to me as impossible and ultimately as useless as a theory of life would be. As a consequence of its complexity, architecture is bound to arise from an iterative, embodied, and integrated action that fuses fuses rationality and feeling, analysis and synthesis, knowledge and intuition, empathy and imagination, rather than from an exclusive theory and fully rationalized processes. There are surely theory-based and rational aspects and phases in the design process, but in its entirety the process is iteratively synthetic. Architectural design, as creative processes in general, is guided by a subjective and mostly subconscious self-piloting action, and an immense embodied and mental identification, immersive, embodied and mental identification with the concrete task that fuses aspects of the multifarious, irreconcilable categories. Let me repeat. The design process is not a rational path, as it consists of countless and repeated deviations, dead ends, new beginnings, hesitations, temporary certainties, and a gradual emergence of an acceptable goal as the result of the process itself. The structure, the structure and essence of the design task are gradually revealed as the design response emerges. Questions and answers are formulated simultaneously in architectural and artistic creativity, and both are subject to the unpredictabilities of the creative process. This I find important. In the world of art, the questions and the answers arise simultaneously, and they are always linked. Due to the existential content of architecture, its design cannot be a smooth, rational problem-solving process. Like poetry, all buildings that move us are usually closer to personal confessions than problem solving. The sublime space, sorry, I don't seem to have the image here, but I just mentioned it, the sublime empty space of the Salk Institute in La Jolla, California, designed by Louis Kahn, I will have an image later, could not possibly have been predetermined in the brief of a client. It is a product of the process itself. Such remarkable inventions can only arise from the process. They cannot be preconceived. Like poetry, all buildings that move us are usually closer to personal confessions, as I said. Also, the most inspiring architectural texts are often personal and poetic evocations rather than results of scientific research. You have noticed now that against my reputation as a theorist, I tend to speak against theory. Sorry. The poetic and phenomenological approach. The phenomenon of architecture has been approached through subjective and personal encounters in poetic, aphoristic or essayistic ways, as in the writings of many of the leading architects from Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier to Alvarado and Louis Kahn, and further today to Stephen Hall and Peter Zumthor. In these writings, architecture is approached in a poetic and metaphorical manner, without any ambitions or qualifications as scientific research. These writings usually arise from personal experiences, observations, and beliefs, and they approach architecture as a poetic encounter and a projection of life, and their ambition is to be experientially true. I must personally confess that these personal and often confessional accounts have valorized the existential and poetic essence of architecture to me more than the theoretical or empirical studies that claim to satisfy the criteria of science. Historically, there are three categories in the seeking of meaning in human existence. I have illustrated the three categories here: religion or myth, art, and science. Three ways to find meaning. And these endeavors are fundamentally incomparable with each other. The first, meaning religion and faith, is based on faith, the second on rational knowledge, and the third on existential and emotive experiences. The poetic, experiential, and existential core of art and architecture has to be confronted, lived, and felt rather than understood and formalized intellectually. There are certainly numerous aspects in construction, in its performance, structural reality, formal and dimensional properties, as well as distinct psychological impacts that can be and are being studied scientifically. But the experiential, mental and existential meaning of the entity can only be encountered and internalized. During the past few decades, an experiential approach based on phenomenological encounters and first-person experiences of buildings and settings has gained ground. This thinking is initially based on the philosophies of Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Gaston Bachelard, and other philosophical thinkers. The phenomenological approach, which acknowledges the significant role of embodiment, was introduced into the architectural context by such writers as Sten Eiler Rasmussen, Christian Norberg Schultz, Charles Moore, David Simon, Robert Mugerauer, and Karsten Harris. I also believe that the book entitled Questions of Perception of 1994 by Stephen Hall, Alberto Perez Gomez, and myself helped to spread this manner of thinking, especially in schools of architecture internationally. The meaning of experience. The poetic and existential dimension of architecture is a mental quality, and this artistic and mental essence of architecture emerges in the individual encounter with and experience of the work. In the beginning of his seminal book, Art as Experience, published in 1934, John Dewey, the visionary American pragmatist philosopher, argues, in common conception, the work of art is often identified with the building, book, painting, or statue in its existence apart from human experience. Since the actual work of art is what the product does with and in experience, the result is not favorable to understanding. When artistic objects are separated from both conditions of origin and operation in experience, a wall is built around them that renders almost opaque that general significance with which aesthetic theory deals. End of quote. Here the philosopher connects the condition of making a piece of art and its later encounter by someone else, as in both cases the mental and experiential reality dominates and the work exists as a human experience. The philosopher suggests that the difficulties in understanding artistic phenomena arise from the tradition of studying them as objects outside of human consciousness and experience. Dewey writes further, by common consent, the Parthenon is a great work of art. Yet it has aesthetic standing only as the work becomes an experience for a human being. Art is always the product in experience of an interaction of human beings with their environment. Architecture is a notable instance of the reciprocity of the results in this interaction. The reshaping of subsequent experience by architectural works is more direct and more extensive than in the case of any other art. They not only influence the future, but they record and convey the past. I think every student of art and architecture should read John Dewey's book. Here, Dewey even assigns an actively conditioning role to architecture in relation to the nature of experience itself, as well as to our understanding of the passing of time and history. I formulate this view with the argument that architecture creates frames and horizons for perception, experience, and understanding of the human condition. And consequently, instead of being the end product, it has essentially a mediating role. The true architectural meaning is always beyond the material essence of the building. The significance of experience has been grasped in other art forms, such as theater, cinema, and music, but it has not been understood in relation to such material and utilitarian objects as buildings and larger environments. That is why I have chosen to teach architecture through examples and ideas in other art forms. Time in architectural experience. The significance of the time dimension and temporal experience has not usually been sufficiently acknowledged in studies of architecture, as it has been regained as the art of regarded as the art of articulating space. Carsten Harris, the philosopher, professor of philosophy at Yale University and one of Heidegger's last students. Carsten Harris's statement on the mental meaning of time in architecture is significant. As he writes, architecture is not only about domesticating space, it is also a deep defense against the terror of time. The language of beauty is essentially the language of timeless reality. Beautifully formulated thought. For me, this expression, the terror of time, has become very, very important. Since Siegfried Gideon's Space, Time and Architecture of 1941, the art of building has been theorized in terms of space-time continuum as defined in modern physics. But the dimension of time has also its independent mental role in our experience of life, the world, and architecture. We have a deep existential need to be rooted in the continuum of time as much as the continuum of space. We dwell both in space and time, and both dimensions are articulated and domesticated for human purposes by architecture. In the early years of modernity, the founding theoretical writings such as Gideon's canonical History of Modern Architecture applied the Einsteinian space-time concept in art and architecture. Gideon quotes Hermann Minkowski's statement of 1908. Quote, henceforth, space alone or time alone is doomed to fade into a mere shadow. Only a kind of union of both will preserve their existence. Unquote. I have, however, doubted this fusion of space and time into a unit in the arts and architecture, and I'm now convinced that it has been a mistake. The fusion serves the purposes of the notion of motion in the science of physics, but not in human mental phenomena. In lived human world, time maintains its separateness as a fundamental experiential and mental reality, the reality of time. And this was what Carsten Harris argued in my earlier quote of him. Encountering architecture. The experiential approach focuses on the embodied and emotive encounter of the architectural reality and the experiencing person and mind, and in accordance with Dewey's view, this actualizes the architectural dimension. The phenomenological method attempts to approach phenomena without preconceptions and to identify with sensitivity and openness the emergence of emotion and meaning in this unique personal encounter. This experiential meaning is not a cerebral understanding as it arises from the encounter directly and spontaneously. Colin St. John Wilson, the architect of the National Library, of British Library in London, gives a convincing description of this rise of meaning when he writes in his book Architectural Reflections. It is as if I am being manipulated by some subliminal code, not to be translated into words, which acts directly on the nervous system and imagination, at once as though they were one thing. It is my belief that the code acts so directly and vividly upon us because it is strangely familiar. It is, in fact, the first language we ever learned, long before words, and which is now recalled to us through which alone holds the key to revive it. This is Colin St. John Wilson, one of my closest friends ever, at whose deathbed I was in London. Beyond, here is now the Salk Institute, sublime emptiness. Beyond its constitution in experience, architecture mediates between the outer world and the inner realm of the self, projecting frames of perception and understanding. This interchange is necessarily an exchange. As I enter a space, the space enters me and changes me, my experience, and my self-understanding. In fact, today's neuroscience maintains that our experiences actually change our brain and neural system. Mediation is essential in all art, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty states firmly, we come to see not the work of art, but the world according to the work. This is probably the most significant sentence I can give to you tonight. This also reveals the complete mistake in today's self-centered architecture, and architecture as self-expression, which is just a stupid idea. Philosopher's view, which I quoted earlier, rejects the regrettably common understanding of art and architecture as artistic self-expression. One of the greatest realistic painters of last century, Balthus, whose real name was Count Balthasar Klosowski de Rola, makes a strong comment against artistic self-expressions. As he writes, artists usually speak about expressing themselves in their work. Nothing like that has ever occurred to me. If a work only expresses the person who created it, it wasn't worth doing. Expressing the world, understanding it, that is what seems interesting to me. Great painting has to have universal meaning. This is sadly no longer so today, and this is why I want to give painting back its lost universality and anonymity, because the more anonymous painting is, the more real it is. This is an interesting argument to also project on architecture, our own craft. I would completely agree with Baltus in this idea. The meaning of art and architecture is outside of the work itself, and it always reaches beyond itself. A fundamental starting point in the experiential approach to art and architecture is the fusion or continuum of the physical and the mental, the outer and the inner realms without categoric boundaries. Rainer Maria Rilke used the beautiful notion Weltinnenraum, the interior space of the world. In the endlessness of the universe, architecture frames our Weltinnenraum, our place, interior and domicile in both space and time, infinity and eternity. Merleau-Ponty tells us enigmatically, the world is wholly inside and I am wholly outside of myself. This sounds like a complete paradox, but think about it. It's a really wise formulation. This seems to point at the chiasmatic intertwining of the outer and the inner realms, the material and the mental, a kind of a Möbius strip which has two sides but only one surface. It's a magical image. Intuiting architecture. Profound architects have always intuitively understood that buildings structure, reorient, and attune our mental realities. They have also been capable of imagining the experiential and emotive reactions of the other. The fact that artists have intuited mental and neural phenomena, often decades before psychology or neuroscience has identified them, is the subject matter of Jonah Lehrer's thought-provoking book. Proust was a neuroscientist, and here he's referring to Marcel Proust, the great writer. In this book he presents 12 artists since the mid-19th century who intuited neurological phenomena decades, and in some cases a century before science identified them. In his pioneering book entitled The Survival Through Design of 1954, published more than 6 decades ago, Richard Neutra acknowledges the biological and neurological realities and makes a suggestion that is surprising for its time. This is what Neutra wrote in 1954. Our time is characterized by a systematic rise of the biological sciences and is turning away from oversimplified and mechanistic views of the 18th and 19th centuries, without belittling in any way the temporary good such views may have once delivered. An important result of this new way of regarding this business of living may be to bear and raise appropriate working principles and criteria for design, Today, design may exert a far-reaching influence on the nervous makeup of generations. As a young architect, I used to consider Richard Neutra as a Hollywood architect, but I have developed a high respect for him after having read some of his texts. Thanks to electronic instruments such as fMRI scanner, today, 65 years later, we know that this is the case. Also, Alvarado intuited the biological ground of architecture in his statement, "I would like to add my personal emotional view that architecture and its details are in some way all part of biology." I'm saying this because I very firmly think that architecture schools should begin to teach biology and evolutionary theory before it's too late. The direct impact of settings on the human nervous system and brain has been proven by research in today's neuroscience. Quote, "While the brain controls our behavior and genes control the blueprint for the design and structure of the brain, the environment can modulate the function of the genes and ultimately the structure of the brain. Changes in the environments change the brain, and therefore they change our behavior." Environmental psychology in the 70s argued that environments change our behavior. No, environments change our neural system, and that changes our behavior. So the influence is even deeper and completely beyond denial. This is a statement by Fred Gage, who's one of the founders of the neuroscience for architecture. There are 2 schools of architecture in the world where neuroscience is taught today. One is in La Jolla, in the New School of Architecture, and the other one is a course at the University of Venice. We architects unknowingly operate with neurons and neural connections. This realization heightens the human responsibility in the architect's work. I myself used to see buildings as aestheticized objects, but for 3 decades now, architectural images have been primarily mental images or experiences of the human condition and mind. I have also gradually understood the significance of the designer's empathic capacity, the gift to simulate and empathize with the experience of the little man, as Alvarado used to say. This interface between the material and the mental worlds is so fundamental that philosophers and neuroscientists such as Alva Noe increasingly see this continuum constituting the human consciousness. Clearly, our consciousness is not located in the brain as it is out there. It is a relation between the world and the mind, so it cannot be placed. Alva Noe simply says the reason why scientists have not been able to locate human consciousness is that they have been seeking in the wrong place. They have been seeking for it in the head, in the brain. I wish to argue that architecture is also a verb, as its true essence is always an invitation to action and specific guidance or choreography of that action. It is this verb-like tendency towards active search and exploration that unites architecture and the human mind. Architecture is also a promise a pledge, and an offer of human order, predictability and security, both physical and mental. Vision and existential sense. Until recently, architecture has primarily been seen as a visual art form, experienced and judged by the eye. This view is expressed most notably by Le Corbusier in his Credo in 1926. Architecture is the masterly, correct, and magnificent play of masses brought together in light. He also spoke of the eye of the truth. The hegemony of vision has been pointed out by a number of contemporary thinkers. I have my book, The Eyes of the Skin, is very much about the critique of the hegemony of vision. Simply, we have made ourselves visual creatures. We used to be creatures that heard and smelled the world before seeing. Then one of, let me see now. After having investigated the phenomenon of architecture for 60 years as an architect, writer, and teacher, I have no hesitation in arguing today that our most important sense in architectural experience is not vision, but the extended haptic sense, the existential sense, our sense of bodily being and self. Architecture addresses primarily the experience of our embodied sense of being, of our experience of being in the world, rather than merely vision or any other of the 5 Aristotelian senses. In Merleau-Ponty's argument, his expression, the argument being, my perception is not a sum of visual, tactile, and audible givens. I perceive in a total way with my whole being. I grasp a unique structure of the thing, a unique way of being which speaks to all my senses at once. Yes, we sense by means of our very existence. I'm coming towards the end of my talk. It is evident that we encounter and judge environments and architecture through our most synthetic sense, our sense of being and self. Merleau-Ponty's notion, the flesh of the world, makes this view understandable. Quote, our own body is in the world as the heart is in the organism. It keeps the visible spectacle constantly alive. It breathes life into it and sustains it inwardly, and with it forms a system. Yes, we exist in this flesh of the world and grasp our existence through being part of that very flesh. Merleau-Ponty suggests poetically that Paul Cézanne's paintings make us feel how the world touches us. That is exactly also the task of architecture. The architecture should show us how the world touches us and how we touch the world. I wish to add that architecture goes even a step further, as it enables us to dwell in the flesh of the world itself, not only to observe it. Architecture gives us our domicile in this existential flesh, both physically and mentally. Architecture also activates and strengthens our sense of self, as its experience is always individual, contextual, and unique. Art and architecture seem to address each one of us individually. That's also the great humanity of art, is that it always addresses each one individually. When you go to a museum and look at the masterpiece silences everything, all noise, and speaks to you directly, you and the masterpiece. This is the consequence of John Dewey's suggestions that the work of art is always an individual creation in experience. Besides, if I am unable to project meaning into my encounter with a place, space, or building, there is really no architecture, just the physical setting. This is the non-place, to use the notion of Edward Relf. And then I have my final chapter, Experience in Literature and Arts. I want to make a suggestion that architecture could be taught by literary means and through literature. The imaginative experience of spaces and events experienced when reading a novel is a most impressive example of the capacity of our imaginative minds. While reading, we keep constructing objects, rooms, houses, and entire cities. And even more miraculously, we create the flesh, the reality sense in which these events are embedded. We architects should study how great writers make us not only enter literary realities, but construct them in our imaginations. We need to learn to see, imagine, and feel drawings as experienced and lived, but that calls for a capacity of imagination elevated to second power. Paul Cézanne argued that there are no lines in nature, only edges and boundaries. This inherent tactility is also true of architecture. All lines in buildings are essentially haptic, not visual. Jean-Paul Sartre writes, "When I'm reading Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, I project my own sense of frustrated waiting on the character of Raskolnikov. The emotions in the artistic experience are our own emotions." And this is the great human gift of art, is that we can sense through the skin and muscles of Michelangelo, we can hear through the ears of Mozart or Bach, and we can see through the eyes of Matisse, if we wish to, and we can feel through the heart of Rilke. Thank you.